Now that we have a great understanding of what del C del M and del C del B are, our partial derivatives of cost with respect to all of our model parameters, M and B, we've calculated these slopes a couple of different ways now. We've calculated them using AutoDiff and PyTorch. We've also manually derived del C del M and del C del B to manually calculate what these partial derivatives are. So now is a great point for me to introduce to you what a gradient of cost is. So the gradient of cost, which is symbolized as nabla C, so this triangle pointing down, or this delta, it seems to be a lowercase Greek letter delta flipped upside down, we pronounce this as nabla C. And this is a vector of all of the partial derivatives of C with respect to each of the individual model parameters. So we can symbolize this a couple different ways. You can just have it stand alone as nabla C, or you can put a P indicating your particular model parameters as a subscript on the nabla. Ultimately, however, what this is it's a vector, a vertical vector, so we transpose it to vertical, the kinds of operations that you will have learned in the linear algebra live lessons that I have separately. And contained within this vector is the partial derivative of cost with respect to each one of our model's parameters. So if we have n model parameters, then we have n del C del P I. So for I equals 1, 2, all the way through to however many n parameters we have an individual del C del P value. So in our case, with our simple linear regression, where we only have two parameters b and m, nabla C is equal to simply del C del B and del C del M, and that's it. So this is easy enough for us to create a gradient object, a nabla C object in PyTorch. It is a vector tensor containing a list of all of our partial derivatives of cost with respect to our model parameters. So I'm putting them in alphabetical order. So B first and then M second. So our gradient is the partial derivative of cost with respect to B, and then the partial derivative of cost with respect to M. Recalling from earlier that this item method simply returns a number out of a slightly more sophisticated PyTorch tensor wrapper. Great, so now that we have our gradient, what can we do with it? So recalling our three-step machine learning process, remember that step 3 was calculating the derivatives of cost with respect to model parameters. So typically we would use automatic differentiation as we can in PyTorch, but as we just recently did, you could also do this manually if you'd like to. It just becomes increasingly tedious as your models become larger and larger and larger. And once we have our partial derivatives of cost with respect to model parameters from this step 3, we can then use those partial derivatives to descend the gradient of cost with respect to our model parameters. Up until this point, I've been describing descending cost with respect to a single model parameter, but this gradient, which is really just another fancy word for slope, is actually a multi-dimensional space that consists of cost with respect to all of our model's parameters. So with a model with 2 parameters, our cost is a function of our 2 model parameters, m and b. If we had more than 2 parameters in our model, then this is a higher dimensional space, which becomes really tricky for me to be able to have illustrated. Our feeble human brains can really only comprehend visually 3 dimensions, but computers can handle many more. And so quickly talking about the situation here where we have 2 model parameters, m and b first, we then have this 3-dimensional valley of cost with respect to m and b. And our objective is to use the gradient which captures this relationship. So our gradient captures cost with respect to all of our model parameters, in this case these two model parameters, and allows us to find the slope in all available dimensions that will most quickly bring us to the valley of lowest cost down here. And so again, with two model parameters, easy to visualize. If we had more than two, it's a higher dimensional space, but the theory is the same. We have a now high dimensional gradient of slope in many dimensions, and we use gradient descent to adjust our m and b, or whatever parameters we have, those values slightly in the direction of lower cost until we descend all the way down to the valley of lowest cost. Perfect. So armed with all of that knowledge, we can now move forward to situations where we calculate the gradient of cost with respect to multiple model parameters, where we don't just have a single point that we're working with at a time, but we work with entire batches of data at a time. Up next, we'll jump to the batch regression gradient notebook to do just that.